Hello everyone, and welcome to Translationborne. This is a series where we're going to be looking at the translation of Bloodborne. If you're looking for skilled or speedy gameplay, or any kind of PvP action, this is not the right place. We're going to be analyzing some of the choices that were made in taking the game from the Japanese version to the English version. That having been said, we've got a lot to cover, so let's get started.
Oh, yes. Pale blood. Well, you've come to the right place. Yharnam is the home of blood ministration. You need only unravel its mystery. But where's an outsider like yourself to begin? Easy, with a bit of Yharnam blood of your own. But first, you'll need a contract.
Quite the opening cutscene. Now that we're at the character creation screen though, I think it's only fitting that I give you a little bit more information about myself and this series. My name is Matt, I'm a freelance translator, and I absolutely love this game. I've been interested in the Japanese version of this game since I started playing it, and I thought talking about the translation process might be something other people would be interested in. So the first topic I'd like to touch on is written character limitations, and the origin screen we're coming up on is a great place to start looking at that. I'm quickly going to read the English while the Japanese is on screen. Milquetoast, ordinary happy upbringing, all attributes average. Lone survivor of lost hamlet, high life essence and vigor. Troubled childhood, suffered misfortune in youth, highly resilient as a result. Violent past, terribly violent past, rash but stronger for it. Professional, born specialist, fit for sleuthing or academia. Military veteran, experienced in war, a soldier with strength and skill. Noble scion, scion to a respectable line with faith in your pedigree. Cruel fate, faced terrible hardships, but now confident in your purpose. Waste of skin, you are nothing, talentless, you shouldn't have been born. Alright, so those are all of the origins. There's actually a lot of interesting things in terms of translation that we could touch on while we're on this screen, but I'd really like to highlight the character limitations, like I said before. So you can tell just by looking at this screen that you don't exactly have a lot of room to write great volumes of information. At most, you get 2 short lines in the description, and every space or letter or whatever is going to count against you. And one of the interesting things about written Japanese is that you can generally convey more information in a limited character space than you can in English. This can lead to a unique set of challenges when you're doing something like translating text for a video game. And a good example of this kind of challenge can be found in the origin Waste of Skin, where in the Japanese, the title of the origin, which is displayed as you're making your selections, and the final line of the origin history is actually exactly the same. If for some strange reason the English translation followed the exact same pattern, you would go from cruel fate to you shouldn't have been born, the description of which would read, you are nothing, talentless, you shouldn't have been born. Waste of Skin is therefore not only a brilliant workaround that avoids repetition, it also fits within the character limitations of the titles for the origins. Of course, I don't really have any way of knowing what those character limitations are, but taking a look at some of the other names can help provide an idea. The longest of the origin names is Troubled Childhood, which is 18 characters long. The phrase, you shouldn't have been born, is 29 characters long. So it seems pretty likely to me that the origin title character limitations are either 18 exactly, or maybe up to 20, as that's a bit of a more round number. I also suspect that the maximum number of characters allowed under the description for an origin is right at 30. The origin that has the longest description line is Cruel Fate. The second line, now confident in your purpose, is exactly 30 characters long. What makes me suspect that 30 characters is the limit is actually that in combination with the Lone Survivor origin description. The first line is Lone Survivor of Lost Hamlet, and that would sound a bit more natural if it were Lone Survivor of a Lost Hamlet, except that Lone Survivor of Lost Hamlet is 29 characters long, and to add the letter A and then another space to make it its own word would put it at 31 characters. So these kinds of character limitations can play a pretty big role in the translation process. They can lead to translations like Waste of Skin, which is a concise and thematically consistent way of conveying the idea of you shouldn't have been born, but they can also help explain why something might sound a little bit off or clunky, like in the case of Lone Survivor of Lost Hamlet. As a freelance translator myself, I can speak from experience when I say, this kind of thing comes up a lot. Okay, with all of that said, let's finalize our character and get started with the game.
Good. All signed and sealed. Now, let's begin the transfusion. Oh, don't you worry. Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
You found yourself a hunter.
And so we awaken in an operating room, not really sure what's real or what's going on. We can try to go further into the clinic, but we'll find that the door is shut and will not open from this side. Upon turning around, though, we'll find an important lore note with major implications for the story and interesting translation choices. The English translation is handwritten scrawl. Seek pale blood to transcend the hunt. Okay, a couple things here. First, the initial line in the Japanese actually contains a bit more information. The note begins, Jihitsu no hashirigaki. Now the hashirigaki part is what's being translated as scrawl. Literally it means something like running writing. It would be like saying you dashed something off as you wrote it. But the first part of the Japanese, the jihitsu, actually refers to either your own writing or the fact that you are writing something yourself. So why didn't that make it through to the English version? Well, I suspect that this is once again another case where character limitations are influencing the translation. One possible translation that would convey that information might be scrawled in your own hand. The problem with that is that it's 25 characters long. Handwritten scrawl, on the other hand, is exactly 18 characters, which you'll remember was also the length of the phrase troubled childhood back on the origins screen. While I don't know whether this is the case, it seems entirely possible to me that these two translation headings were put together in the same category and had the same character limitations. There are also a few things about the fictional setting of the game that might also allow you to make an argument for leaving that kind of information out. No other note in the game, at least as far as I know, has any indication of its authorship. And as you'll see when we start looking at the descriptions of our attire, our character is supposed to have amnesia of some kind. Our past is obscure and unknown. So cutting the note down to handwritten scrawl seems to me like the kind of reasonable compromise situation you can find yourself in when you're looking for a solution to not having enough character space. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning about this lore note is the way that it uses the phrase, seek pale blood to transcend the hunt. The Japanese there, matto suru, literally means completely end, or maybe fulfill. And in the context of this game, the subtle difference that you might find in those concepts can be very important. So this particular translation choice is one that I think we should come back to after we've seen a bit more of the game. And now, since it took me forever to kill this guy, which means I have a little bit of time, I'd like to make a more general point about the game that ties in with something you may have picked up on already. As you are no doubt thoroughly aware of by now, I am playing the Japanese version of this game, and yet all of the voice acting you've been hearing has been done in English. This is something that the Souls series, which Bloodborne really is a part of, has done from the beginning. The text is in Japanese, and yet all of the voices are in English. This is actually one of the reasons I decided to use this game for this series, because if you're a native English speaker, all of the cutscenes will be understandable to you. And as this guy just demonstrated by calling me a plague-ridden rat, it's not just the major cutscenes, it's also the smaller characters that have their voiceovers done in English. As an English-speaking audience, I feel like this is something we can kind of take for granted, but from the perspective of a Japanese player, it creates more of a unique play experience. The closest experience I can think of for the English-speaking world might be games like The Last Guardian or Shadow of the Colossus. Those games have their voice acting done in unique fantasy languages that you need to read English subtitles in order to understand what's going on. That's something that helped give those games a very unique play experience, and playing Bloodborne in Japanese would have given you something of a similar vibe. It's an additional layer of atmosphere that isn't fully accessible to an English player, really. Of course, with all that having been said, Bloodborne is actually unique, as far as I know, in the Souls series, in that you can change the language settings in your preferences and have some, but not all, of the voiceover work be switched to Japanese. I'm going to be cataloging the Japanese voices in a reference material series, but for Translationborne itself, I'll be playing with the default settings of English voices and Japanese text. Now I'm going to cut a loading screen, and I'll see you all in the Hunter's Dream. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to The Hunter's Dream, Karyudo no Yume. Something to note about this place name is that it uses one of two words that the game has for hunter. That would be Karyudo, and it's the only term we've run across so far, but as we continue to play, there will be at least one other term that we're introduced to. I'll talk more about this when we get to that other term, but for now know that Karyudo is pretty much a general term in Japanese for hunter. And now that I've figured out how to wave, it's time to take a look at some more item descriptions. Although actually, now that this message is on screen, I'd just like to say I think the official term trick weapon is a great way to handle what's literally weapon set up with mechanism or device. It gets across the sense that there's more to this weapon than meets the eye, and does it in what I would say is a fairly cool and also concise way. So let's get to those descriptions. Threaded cane, one of the trick weapons of the workshop, commonly used by hunters on their duties. Sufficiently deadly as a rigid-bladed cane, but also serves as a whip when its blade is split into many. Concealing the weapon inside the cane and flogging the beasts with the whip is partly an act of ceremony, an attempt to demonstrate to oneself that the bloodlust of the hunt will never encroach upon the soul. Alright, there's a lot of information on these weapons to process here, but for now I'd like to point out something that's really best illustrated by reading these descriptions right in a row. So, let's move on to the next weapon. Hunter Axe, one of the trick weapons of the workshop, commonly used on the hunt. Retains the qualities of an axe, but offers a wider palette of attacks by transforming. Boasts a heavy blunt attack, leading to high rally potential. No matter their pasts, beasts are no more than beasts. Some choose this axe to play the part of executioner. Okay, you may not have noticed, But the English for the very first line in these descriptions is slightly different. The Japanese, though, is exactly the same. Now, last weapon. Saw Cleaver, one of the trick weapons of the workshop, commonly used in the hunting business. This saw, effective at drawing the blood of beasts, transforms into a long cleaver that makes use of centrifugal force. The saw, with its set of bloodletting teeth, has become a symbol of the hunt, and only grows in effectiveness the more grotesquely transformed the beast. So for all three of these weapons, the first line is exactly the same in Japanese, while the English is a bit different. For the threaded cane, we have one of the trick weapons of the workshop, commonly used by hunters on their duties. The hunter axe is one of the trick weapons of the workshop, commonly used on the hunt. Finally, the saw cleaver was one of the trick weapons of the workshop, commonly used in the hunting business. Clearly there's some variation there, but we still haven't gotten our left-handed weapons yet. Let's take a look at those descriptions. Hunter Blunderbuss, a blunderbuss created at the workshop for the hunter's line of work. Hunter firearms are specially crafted to employ quicksilver bullets fused with the wielder's own blood, boosting damage against beasts. The impact of this highly effective weapon counters beasts' swift movements, and its wide spread is nigh on guaranteed to hit the mark. So with the variation of lines for the right-hand weapons in mind, let's take a look at what happens to the first line of the left-hand weapons. First, watch the top line of the Japanese as I switch. Okay, no change. Now the English. Hunter Pistol. Pistol made at the workshop for hunters stalking beasts. Hunter firearms are specially crafted to employ quicksilver bullets fused with the wielder's own blood, boosting damage against beasts. The pistol is a quicker draw than the blunderbuss, allowing for speedier responses to attacks. Alright, so we see the same pattern. The first line is clearly the same in Japanese, while in English we have a difference. Once again, back to back, the first line of the hunter pistol is pistol made at the workshop for hunters stalking beasts. Hunter blunderbuss is a blunderbuss created at the workshop for the hunter's line of work. I wanted to point out this variation because it's fairly subtle, but I think it does an effective job of making each weapon feel more unique. Now let's do some more quick reading. Hunter's Mark. Dangling upside-down rune etched in one's mind. Symbol of a hunter. By focusing one's thoughts on this rune, a hunter loses all blood echoes, but awakens afresh, as if it were all just a bad dream. Note here that the phrase upside-down rune is more like strung upside down or hanged upside down rune in Japanese. Okay, notebook. Messengers are inhabitants of the dream who revere the brave hunters. Use them to send messages to other worlds. Leave notes with messengers, read the notes left to messengers in other worlds, and write notes to reach out to hunters across the planes of existence. There are a couple of interesting points here. First of all, a more literal way to render the messengers are inhabitants of the dream phrase would actually be messengers lurk in nightmares. And second, what's literally dimensions has been rendered here a much more interesting planes of existence. Now the attire. Black hood. Hood worn upon awakening to the nightmare of blood and beasts. Perhaps its wearer had to stay out of sight and travel by cover of darkness. Without memory, who will ever know? Interesting translation choice I'll get back to here. Foreign garb. Clothing worn upon awakening to the nightmare of blood and beasts. Not typical clothing for Yharnam. Perhaps it is of foreign origin. It is said, after all, the traveler came to Yharnam from afar. Without memory, who will ever know? Oh, and I should note that for the attire, the repeated lines are the same in both languages. Okay, sullied bandage. Bandage worn upon awakening to the nightmare of blood and beast. Terribly worn and unsanitary. A faint memory recalls blood ministration, involving the transfusion of unknown blood. Not long after, the nightmare began. And since the foreign trousers description is essentially the same as the foreign garb description, I'm going to move right on into making the point that I brought up a little while ago. The first line here, Chi to kemono no akumu kara mezameta toki, would normally be translated upon awakening from the nightmare of blood and beasts, not upon awakening to the nightmare. I'm not really sure why they ended up going with this particular translation choice. The result is that in Japanese it seems like the nightmare of blood and beasts is the cutscene we see after character creation, while in English that's less clear. But let's talk to Gehrman.
Aha! You must be the new hunter. Welcome to the hunter's dream. This will be your home for now. I am
Gammon. Friend to you hunters. You're sure to be in a fine haze about now, but don't think too hard about all of this. Just go out and kill a few beasts. It's for your own good. You know, it's just what hunters do. You'll get used to it. This was once a safe haven for hunters. A workshop where hunters used blood to enhance their weapons and flesh. We don't have as many tools as we once did, but you're welcome to use whatever you find. Even the dog, should it please you.
Okay, I think that's all he has to say.
This was once a workshop. You're even.
Yes, we have repeating dialogue, so I'm going to read this lore note over here and we're going to process the information. To escape this dreadful hunter's dream, halt the source of the spreading scourge of beasts, lest the night carry on forever. So in this case, the translation of this note matches the Japanese pretty closely. So let's get back to Gehrman's dialogue. There are a few interesting things to discuss about it. First of all, when he says that he's a friend to us hunters, the word he uses in the Japanese could be more literally translated as an advisor. Or to get even more literal, he's someone who offers helpful words. This I think is interesting because it casts a kind of different light on his role. Another thing I'd like to touch on briefly is how much I like the translation where he says, "You're sure to be in a fine haze about now." A more literal translation there would be something like, "You probably don't know what's going on right now," and it's considerably more boring. The translation as it stands now, I think, does a much better job of evoking the kind of atmosphere that really helps to make this game. Finally, concerning the phrase, "We don't have as many tools as we once did, but you're welcome to use whatever you find," I feel like the translation goes for a very interesting trade-off. The Japanese is a bit clearer about the fact that several of the tools have been lost at this point, but we can use whatever's left however we want. The English is a little bit more vague about what's happened to the tools. He just says, "We don't have as many tools as we once did," but it's also more vague about the tools that we can use. The English line is literally, "You're welcome to use whatever you find." What we find and where we find it is less clearly defined. It's not, "Hey, we've lost a bunch of stuff, but you can use what's left." It's, "We used to have more here, and whatever you find, do what you want with it." Like I said before, I think this is an interesting trade-off, and I really like the ambiguity that they've been able to achieve with the English, since ultimately you'll end up finding workshop tools all over the place. Now for some more item descriptions. Blood vial. Special blood used in ministration. Raises HP. Once a patient has had their blood ministered, a unique but common treatment in Yharnam, successive infusions recall the first and are all the more invigorating for it. No surprise that most Yharnamites are heavy users of blood. Quicksilver bullets. Special bullets used with hunter firearms. Ordinary bullets have no effect on beasts, and so quicksilver bullets, fused with the wielder's own blood, must be employed. The strength of quicksilver bullets depends greatly upon the wielder's blood tinge. These are both great translations if you ask me, and hopefully I'll have time to get into them more later. But for now, let's take a look at the attire. Yharnam Hunter Cap. Ludwig, the first hunter of the Healing Church, once recruited Yharnamites to serve as hunters. This hunter's attire was made for new recruits and has excellent straightforward defense, but not nearly enough to allow an ordinary man to stand any real chance against the beasts. And since the rest of this attire has the exact same description, I'm just going to talk over it. So the most interesting translation choice in this set is probably the last line. A more literal translation might be, "Though should anyone ordinary challenge a beast, this would provide little more than peace of mind." That's as opposed to, "Not nearly enough to allow an ordinary man to stand any real chance against the beasts." This is really part of an ongoing challenge in translation about how literal you're going to be. What aspects of the original meaning of a phrase are you going to keep intact, and how are you going to do that? And I would argue that the Yharnam Hunter attire is one of the many places where they get this balancing act right. When you've got something that says the only protection it's going to provide you physically is peace of mind, you're saying that it's not going to provide you with any real protection. And the translation as it stands, I think, sounds a lot better than something literal. Okay, let's talk to Yasefka.
Are you out on the hunt? Then I'm very sorry, but I cannot open this door. I am Yosefka. The patients here in my clinic must not be exposed to infection. I know that you hunt for us, for our town, but I'm sorry. Please. This is all that I can do. Now, go. And good hunting. Are you still in need of something? But I have nothing more to offer. Please, try to understand my position. I can only pray for a fruitful hunt.
Alright, as usual, there are a few things to talk about here, but first let me read this item description. Yosefka's blood vial. Blood vial acquired from Yosefka's clinic. This refined blood, highly invigorating, restores a larger amount of HP. The product of a slow and careful refinement process, this rare blood vial appears to be a clinic original. So, to comment on the blood vial first, the thing that really jumps out at me about this translation is the role of Yosefka herself. The first line of the Japanese makes it clear that you're not just receiving this from the clinic, but the female doctor is handing the blood vial over to you. Likewise, in the final line of the Japanese, it's emphasized that this isn't just a clinic original, but it's something that the female doctor herself has put a lot of time into making. This isn't really that big of a difference, especially since the clinic is Yosefka's clinic, and it's pretty clear that we're talking to Yosefka. This is probably another case of character limitations affecting the translation, but I did think it was worth bringing up because it was interesting. As for the dialogue from Yosefka herself, there were a couple things that I wanted to talk about. First is the opening line, actually. In the English, she jumps straight to, "Are you out on the hunt?" But in Japanese, she spends most of the first line asking who we are. A more literal translation might be, "Oh, who are you? Are you a hunter, perhaps?" Now, I happen to prefer her cutting to the chase and asking if we're out on the hunt, but I do think it's an interesting change that influences our perception of her character. Also, there was one other quick point I'd like to make about Yosefka's dialogue. The final line that she gives you when you first speak to her, and after you talk to her when you've received the blood vial already, in Japanese those two lines are the same. It would translate to something like, "I pray for the success of your hunt." In English, she says, "and good hunting," for the first time, and "I can only pray for a fruitful hunt," the second time. The result, I think, is a nice bit of variation and a little bit of extra information. Note also that the first phrase, "and good hunting," adds something of a personal note. On the other hand, "I can only pray for a fruitful hunt" is more impersonal, which fits her denying us better. Now for more dialogue.
Oh, you must be a hunter, and not one from around here either. I'm Gilbert, a fellow outsider. You must have had a fine time of it. Yarnum has a special way of treating guests. Well, I don't think I could stand if I wanted to, but I'm willing to help if there's anything that can be done. This town is cursed. Whatever your reasons might be, you should plan a swift exit. Whatever can be gained from this place, it will do more harm than good. Pale blood, you say? Never heard of it. But if it's blood you're interested in, you should try the Healing Church. The church controls all knowledge on blood ministration and all varieties of blood. Across the valley to the east of Yarnum lies the town of the Healing Church, known as the Cathedral Ward. And deep within Cathedral Ward is the old Grand Cathedral, the birthplace of the Healing Church's special blood, or so they say. Yarnumites don't share much with outsiders. Normally they wouldn't let you near the place, but the hunt is on tonight. This might be your chance. Across the valley to the east of Yarnum, you'll find the Cathedral Ward. Deep within lies the old main cathedral, said to be the source of blood. I haven't heard of pale blood, but that's your best bet if it's anything to do with unique types of blood.
Alright, so that was a lot of dialogue, but there's actually only a few small points I'd like to bring up in regards to it. First, here and in a few other places we've now encountered the other term for hunter. That would be kemonogari, literally hunter of beasts. But for now, just keep that in mind. I'm going to move on to this item description. Pebble. Small pebbles found throughout Yharnam. Can be thrown at foes. Quite thrilling. I bring this up now because I absolutely love this translation, especially the last line where it says, quite thrilling, in English. A more literal translation of the Japanese there would have been something like, there's nothing better. But the phrase quite thrilling gives it a really nice, almost perverse edge. I think it's perfect. Okay, so briefly back to Gilbert. When he says this town has a special way of treating guests, the Japanese more literally is something like, the inhabitants of this town are all really gloomy or unpleasant. I think this is a great example of rewording things in order to make them sound a bit more natural. We've gone from a direct way of saying essentially, these people are jerks, to making it more of an implication. One change that you do get by saying that Yharnam has a special way of treating guests is that you emphasize this nastiness is only directed at outsiders. There's a lot of other context in the Japanese, though, that shows you that Yharnamites aren't fans of foreigners at all. So there's good reason for the implication. Ultimately, I think this is a really good example of how and when to reword things. It can be easy when you're in the middle of translating something to fall into the trap of, this is what it says, so this is what it is. Meanwhile, there might be another much more interesting and natural-sounding way for you to get across that same information. And that's about all the time I have for today, so I hope you enjoyed this first episode, and I'll see you next time. In the meantime, please do let me know if you have any comments, suggestions, or questions. Thanks!